Anatsui is an artist that I was following for quite some time, and I was always intrigued whenever I happened to come across one of his works, as for example at the art fair in Basel, Art Unlimited. And then some years ago I had the chance to see some earlier works in Amsterdam, some drawings of his, and I realized something which is actually quite simple, that his bottle cap works did not just fall from heaven, but they came from somewhere. And that behind there is this lifelong thinking about sculpture and what contemporary sculpture could be. And then when we decided we wanted to work with him, we just learned that Haus der Kunst was preparing the ultimate retrospective curated by Okwe Onwezor, who unfortunately passed away the last year, and Chika Okeke Agulu, who is now professor for art, African art and African archaeology in Princeton. And he used to be the assistant of El Anatsui. He was one of the artists that was taught by El Anatsui, because as then I also learned, El Anatsui is not just an incredible artist with a career that spans over 50 years, but he was also a dedicated professor who was among the first professors at the new University of Nigeria in Nsukka in the 70s, and was also in this first generation of artists and art teachers who was thinking about the question, how can we develop an authentic African contemporary art or Nigerian contemporary art? So he was really a forerunner in many, many fields, and the exhibition that Haus der Kunst prepared was special, since it not only concentrated on these famous later works, but also shifted away a bit the perspective of concentrating too much on the anthropological aspects of his work. They wanted to really bring forward what he achieved as an artist, as contemporary art, and being on the same level like here in European Western countries. He was trained as a sculptor, and he had British, European and a German art teacher, so his education was very much informed by European art history. And there was one moment where he realized that it did not quite make sense for him as a Ghanaian artist to work with plaster, as it is usual in a sculpture education, because you can't find plaster anywhere on the African continent. You need to import it from Europe, and this at the moment where young African nations try to cut all ties to European colonial powers. It didn't make sense to still use a material which was not from his surroundings, which there is nothing African about. Because that moment in his career, he was very much focused, as I told earlier, to concentrate on the question, what could be a future or a present authentic African contemporary art. So he realized very early on that he needed to work with what is in his surroundings, which makes, and I think that's also the challenge of a global world. You need to think global but act local. So you translate subjects to your own local situation, and that's where it gains more credibility and also maybe more depth. So that was something he realized very early on, and then he decided to work basically in these early stages with wood, because there was a lot of wood around him. And since he was also trying to connect to his own cultural heritage, he worked with wood that was used, for example, for people, vendors, vegetable vendors on markets. So these plates, these wooden plates, and he started to use them. He ordered them at the same place with the same artisans that produced them for market people, but he used them for art instead. because he was also interested in doing sculpture, but very flat sculpture that you could also, like an image, a painting, hang on the wall. So he took these plates and started to embellish them and started to write on them, and it was the same time that he started to learn more about these different African cultures already in Ghana. For example, he lives now for over 30 years in Nigeria, and in Nigeria alone you have, I think, 300 different languages that are spoken in this whole country. So he learned more about this cultural diversity, and since it was also a colonial prejudice that Africa knows no history, because Africa has no culture, it needs to be civilized, it was for him one point of an argument against this prejudice. He wanted to show how many different languages exist already in Ghana, and that there is very much an African history. It's only an oral history, it's not a written history. And he worked with the language that are based on symbols and that also express small sentences of wisdom. And he started to invent his own sentences and put them on these plates and treated them like like an African artifact, which is very based on a cultural tradition that he renewed at that moment. And then from there he went on. He realized he wanted to develop a sculpture which has a composition but which is not fixed, so that you have like some sort of moving sculpture, and that you not just move whole bodies, but you move parts in itself. And it reminded me very much of the concept that we very well know of the moving image. I mean, the whole second half of 20th century and the 21st century are based on moving image, the concept of moving image. And somehow you could say this is where his interest in a moving sculpture began. So he started to make different panels that you could interchange into each other. And you can change it as you would, so that everyone who acquires an artwork from Anatsui is like his own curator or his own artist who can change it as he wished. And that was, if you start to understand that it started there in the 70s with these wooden sculptures, in the 80s then, it was just a small step to find a way of doing sculpture which is even more mobile, and that the interchangeability is even more accentuated in the sense that it's like a piece of cloth, of textile, that you always need to arrange in a new way. Every time you put a work, a bottle cap work from Anatsui up in a space, you need to rearrange it in a new way. That's his basic concept. It's never done the same way. That was also funny for us, because when we were installing the show, we tried very eagerly to follow all the photographs we had of prior installations, just to learn that the artist wanted a whole new way of installing it in this particular space. So it's always very much centered on the space that we're in. And he wants to be surprised every day. It can change that the work which is horizontal suddenly is vertical. It could even come halfway on the floor. So this is every time, changes every time. And that, I think, is also very fascinating. And then again, with these works, this concept of taking what's in your surroundings. So he lives in Nigeria and in African countries. It's even more important than people recycle stuff. They don't throw it away. It's when you're not living in a rich country, you need to use things again and again. So some time in the late 90s, he discovered a bag full of these bottle caps. It's discarded aluminum bottle caps from liquor bottles that were reused. And he found them in his surroundings and let them be in his studios to think about how he could use them. And then suddenly this idea grew to make a new kind of sculpture with them, but that still are very much on his lifelong search for this form that has a composition, but that you can interchange all the same. And what I find fascinating also with the concept of this show, that it's on one hand very much focused on the artistic achievements of Anatsui, on what he is step by step developing out of a certain historical moment, of a geographical situation, of a cultural and political moment. And on the other hand, it also very much confronts us with the history of himself, of where he grew up and where he lived all his life, and is, so to speak, a political exhibition, but on second sight. Because also his works, they have very meaningful titles with a lot of double meanings. And also if you look at these bottle caps, first you think, okay, it's just garbage he found. It's by coincidence. It doesn't have a deeper meaning. But then the role of liquor is very special. In African countries, after the liberation and the independence, it was for them important to make their own liquor, because liquor was a business that was very much controlled by the colonial forces. So they had to import it and they paid for it. And of course there was also this triangular relation between West Africa, where the slaves were shipped on, to the New World, West Indies or North America, Jamaica, on some sugar plantation where they were exploited. And then the sugar that went back to Europe, where they made liquor from it and brought it to African countries again, or used it even as some way of buying the slaves. So there is also a hint at this very painful history and the role that liquor or the sugar played in this. And what I find especially strong in Anatsui's work is that he often talks about very painful human experiences, and then he turns it into something so beautiful that still has this relation to this painful human experience, but it's like as if he would still find something that gives me hope for our future. And it finds a very poetic means to do that. So, and this I also find, especially now in these times, where it's so hard for us to understand what's going on, how much will this pandemic change our society, our way of how we relate to each other. How can we be open again when it's, so to speak, dangerous to be open and too close? How can we build a better world out of what we went through? And I think this beauty that comes out from such sorrow or such deep roots is, for me, one way that art can help us in this situation, can help us reflect and see that even the sharpest analysis can also turn into something beautiful. And also that from the smallest and the merest things, you can make something so beautiful if you work together, because that's also a strong message for me in this art, that it's always done collectively. Of course, there is one name behind it, it's the label, but Anatsui, he works with whole villages to build these installations, and it needs, so to speak, a whole village to mount them on the wall, because we had, for example, up to 10 people at the same moment to try and install a work like this. So it very much underlines the communality of art and art experience, and he very much tried to invite us to become artistic a bit ourselves. So we know that concept, of course, from Joseph Beuys, who said that each and every one of us can be an artist. And he caused much confusion with this, but of course it opened up this whole development in contemporary art that everything can be art. because if you look at something as being art, you discuss it in a new way, and maybe it helps you also to have new thoughts about this, instead of just discussing it as politics or whatever. And in a way, El Anatsui, he invites us in a very strong gesture too to reflect on these. And also, I mean, it's maybe inviting to try and build a cloth like this yourself, or to look at garbage in a new way, that you realize that by somebody who comes from another culture, but it's not so much about the culture, but an economic situation, that he needs to find a new ways of always dealing with the same material, helps us maybe to find a way out of the problem we have with throwing away everything. And it could still become art as well. So it's also an artwork, a position that asks very much the question about value. What do we ascribe value to? What does it make that we think certain things are more valuable than others? It can't have to do with the material alone, because this looks very valuable, and as an artwork on the market, this is very expensive, but it started in a very small way and in a very cheap way, so to speak. So you see, I find many aspects why I think El Anatsui is an important artist. He has a lot to say to us, and it's not just about what it means to grow up in Western Africa and living in a contemporary African country. And what I also love about El Anatsui's works is that he speaks as much to grown-ups as he speaks to children. And he makes art that talks to everyone. You can just admire it and really enjoy the beauty, the colors, the poetry, or you can be intrigued how it's done from an artisanal point of view, technically, and you can admire his ever new inventiveness to find new ways of folding these bottle caps. But of course, then you can also be amazed of how he constantly readdresses this question about African history, African cultures, and how he finds ways of taking them again and again into his contemporary thinking and in his contemporary works. So there are so many different levels, and it's in such an effortless way that they are presented, and that they speak to us without us knowing all of the contexts. And that for itself, I would say, is a marker for an excellent art. And so it's not based on how much he's an African artist or not, but it's based on how these artworks speak to us. And that's I love this experience every day from anew, and so does our public.